Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast that cuts through the noise of the many policies and regulations that affect American agriculture. Each week, we pull back the curtain on the programs, policies, and perceptions shaping the agricultural community in rural America. If you've ever felt like something doesn't add up, you're not alone. I'm Jenny, and this is Smoke and Mirrors. Let's make sense of the maze we call farm policy. Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast where we make sense of agricultural policy. This week, we're continuing our series on agricultural conservation policy with Katie Doyle of PERC, the Property and Environment Research Center. Katie, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you. Yes, I'm very happy to be here. So, a little bit about myself. I grew up in Texas, born and raised, and I went to Texas Tech University for college, where I studied natural resources management with a concentration in wildlife biology. And as soon as I graduated, I moved straight to Montana, where I started my 4-ish year seasonal life. I was doing different positions in wildlife management, like wildlife research and monitoring and disease sampling, and with some other things mixed in there. And that was in Montana, Idaho, and Texas. And then I decided to go back to school. So I went to the University of Wyoming in Laramie, Wyoming, where I studied the social dimensions of wildlife management. So the people side of wildlife management, which I found extremely interesting. And I wanted to continue working on the people side, which is one of the things that led me to PERC. Where I am now in Bozeman, Montana, and I'm really happy to be here. I've been able to use what I've learned and done and learn from the people that I now work with. And so I'm challenging myself every single day, and it's a fantastic match.
It sounds like fascinating work. Could you tell us a little bit more about PERC? I don't think I've ever heard anybody call it by the full name, and I said it once. I'm just going to say PERC.
Yes.
But could you tell us about what PERC does? But I'd also like to hear about some of their values and priorities around conservation.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're correct. Most people just call it PERC. It's a long name, Property and Environment Research Center. But essentially, we are a nonprofit, and I'll read this part. We have a goal of advancing conservation through markets, incentives, property rights, and partnerships with landowners and other non-government organizations. And essentially, that means we like to make conservation make economic sense so that it can persist into the future.
So would you say like PERC takes a more free market approach to conservation?
Yes.
Okay. And what are the main activities of PERC?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have several departments. Some of our departments include the Conservation Innovation Lab, which is what I'm a part of, our Law and Policy Department, and our Research Department. And we've got our research department is constantly asking questions, working with researchers from other universities and people around the country to ask questions and answer questions. And then we take that information that we've learned into the other departments, law and policy, and then the innovation lab. So then our law and policy center does a lot of work directly in DC. They do amicus briefs. They are always thinking about ways that we could get more involved in the policy that's being discussed or considered relating to conservation and anything else that comes along. And then our innovation lab, which is what I'm part of, is the part that does on-the-ground work with producers and other partners from other organizations. So we like to take ideas that were formed by us internally or by our partner organizations and find a landowner or manager partner and test those ideas on the ground. And so we like to see, what works well in this specific idea. What do we need to further research? What do we need to tweak a little bit if we were to expand that work into other parts of the country or locally?
So PERC does both ideas and on the ground work is what it sounds like. You talk a little bit about how PERC would see the role of producers, farmers and ranchers, the government, and the private sector when we think about agriculture conservation?
Absolutely, yes. So like you said, our work is focused around conservation. And a lot of times we do work with agricultural producers because they're heavily intertwined with conservation work. And one thing I do want to mention is that PERC does not accept any government funding, so state funding or federal funding. But we do work with state and federal agencies when it comes to projects and specific topics.
Okay.
So PERC sees producers as partners, which is very important to us. We fully recognize the land stewardship that producers do every single day when they live and work on the land. And we want to highlight that work to people who are not as involved in conservation work or agricultural production so that producers can get the acknowledgement and the credit that they deserve for doing all of the work that they do. And another thing that we try to make our goal is to make producers financially whole as they're working alongside natural resources like wildlife, for example, that can cause damage to their infrastructure and operations.
And where would PERC see the role of government in terms of broader conservation goals?
Yeah, government is a lot of times the sector that makes regulations or kind of sets standards or expectations. And so they're definitely people that we look to for leadership and how to move forward with our work. And then we move to the private sector when we're looking at ways to be more flexible and say, okay, we know we need to look at XYZ this year or whatever. What are some flexible ways that we can fund this work, or how can we implement it in a new way that hasn't been done before? That type of thing.
So voluntary conservation is a principle held by a lot of the agricultural community, where there's sort of a desire to sort of limit government involvement. Where would PERCs land in sort of that continuum of supporting voluntary conservation efforts versus situations where you might need a stronger role for government?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I will say we do have our law and policy department that can speak more specifically to things like that. But in general, PERC does absolutely support and promote voluntary conservation. And it's something that we believe will help conservation actions persist into the future. It's a lot of people, like you were saying, prefer voluntary action over being mandated to do something. And so if we're looking at how to make conservation long lasting, it's important to choose voluntary action as one of our pillars and one of the things that we look to agricultural producers to help us form a process and help us develop a project. And we're doing this alongside them. This is not something that's supposed to be, from us to them, coming down and regulating them.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, you spend enough time in rural areas, people don't like being told what to do.
Absolutely.
I don't like being told what to do.
No, me either.
Anyway, let's dig more into your work. Can you tell me about your position?
Sure, yeah. So I spoke a little bit about the Conservation Innovation Lab earlier as the department that does on-the-ground work with partners, producers, and other organizations. And so me, as the conservation associate, my job is to support the work of the Conservation Innovation Lab, which looks a variety of different ways. One of the things that I do is I create and maintain relationships with those partners. And then another thing that I'm currently working on, which has come to be quite a large task, is helping the team develop our project intake process, which is how we decide what projects to prioritize for the year, that sort of thing. And also our development of our implementation process and our monitoring process, which has become actually quite tricky. We have a lot of different projects going on in different places, doing different things with different species of concern. And so we're trying to streamline our way to quantify the work that we're doing and how to measure success and how to report our findings back in a more streamlined way. And so that's become one of my biggest time consumptive actions. So those are the biggest things that I'm doing right now.
So it sort of sounds like you have a management role for several projects.
Yeah, in different ways, definitely. We have a small team here, which is really fun. I get to be really involved in some things and take a back seat on other things and sit and learn and listen and then take the leadership role. So it's a great position.
And you mentioned previously a lot of your work's on a virtual fencing project. Can you talk more about that?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. PERC has a lot of virtual fencing going on currently. It's been a priority for us recently. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the different things that we have and have had. Last year, we set up a virtual fence fund, which was essentially a national call for applications for funding for any virtual fencing project. And we got so much interest and a ton of really cool applications from just properties around the country, just way different things and places. And it was really cool. So we got to fund a handful of those. And I'll tell you about a couple. So one of them is a goat herd in Wisconsin that was collared with the intent of excluding the goats from grazing in ecologically sensitive areas for specifically monarch butterflies, Carner blue butterflies, and a couple of bird species of concern like the bobolink. And then another project that was funded through our virtual fencing fund last year was in Oregon. It's a herd of cattle that was virtually fenced with the goal of addressing and managing conflict with predators. In this case, it was wolves that was the concern. But we've seen both of those projects and all the other ones really take off, and it's been really cool to keep up with those producers and see how they're using virtual fencing and what they think they could improve and do better in the future and learn from, and also what they could use it for in ways that they didn't even think about. And then we are partnering with the University of Wyoming on a couple of different projects studying the effects of virtual fencing. And so we've got one project in Montana and one in Wyoming. And then this year, we've got lots of different things on the horizon. One, we're partnering with the Ricketts Conservation Foundation to fund virtual fencing projects in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And then another thing is we're taking a step back from funding individual projects to looking at the broader effects of virtual fencing as a conservation tool and as an economic tool. And then another thing that we're doing, which is related to virtual fencing, but a little bit different, is we are hosting 2 workshops this year as a follow-up to a workshop that we co-hosted in 2024. And then that one was more about the planning process of virtual fencing and what does this look like and how can we use it and what can we expect. And just in that 2-year span, a very short time, we're now talking about what we've seen, the effects that we've seen, the successes we've seen, and how we can continue to move forward with it. So it's really exciting progress.
I certainly have been excited by the promise of virtual fencing
Yes.
for a lot of reasons here in Kansas. But first, can you break down the technology? How good is it? How fail-proof is it?
Sure.
Where's the technology at?
Absolutely, yes. So I have delved in so much deeper than I expected to since being here, but it is really impressive technology. It's generally based on, e-collars for dogs, where you set up the fence perimeter around your backyard, put the collar on your dog, and if they get close, it sends a signal and they know not to go that far. So that's essentially what it's based off of. There are 4 different virtual fencing companies, and they all have slightly different models for their collars and their technology. But generally, you put the collar on your cow, and this is done when they're already held in a chute for different reasons that they're already being kept. So it's not meant to be an extra hands-on time. So you put the collar on and then you draw that perimeter around wherever you want it to be. So you can move it however often you want. You can set it and leave it however you want to do that. So you draw the perimeter on your phone or your computer using the software given to you by the company. And then once the cow moves close to that border, it will send an audio signal saying, you're getting close. And then if they get closer, it'll send a stimulus, like a vibration, to the cow. And some companies and technologies have it set up where, it'll beep on one side of the cow's head so that it knows to turn that way or turn the opposite way. And so it can be used as like a guiding tool, or it can be used as like a yes, no, don't cross here or cross here. And it can be used to like exclude areas of ecological importance, like riparian areas, or even maybe some like larkspur areas or places you don't want your cattle to go. So it can be used in a variety of different ways. There is, of course, a learning curve for somebody who's never used it before, just like with anything. But from what I've heard, it's pretty user-friendly.
Okay, so it's pretty easy to use. You just Right now it's a collar. Does it have to be a collar?
Yes, as of right now, yes. I know there are different ear tags that are experimenting with this technology, but as of now, the collar is the most popular and reliable thing.
Ear tag would be phenomenal.
I know. I know. It's so interesting to watch this technology evolve. I'm so curious to see in 10 years what it'll look like.
Can it break? Does it fall off? Does it stop working? Is failure rate the right word?
So, yes, it can. Each of the technology companies is working on that. That's obviously a big concern if collars can break off, if, a cow is scratching itself or runs into something. Nobody wants that. And so, yes, they can break off every now and then, but from what I understand, that has become so much more improved, I guess is the right way to say it, over the years as these ideas have been continually tested in different ways. And I know that virtual fencing has or was started in New Zealand, so they've had quite a long span of testing these ideas and this technology before it came to the US. So we are actually getting a form of virtual fencing that has already been tested a couple of times.
So the technology is pretty good. And I know, like, I remember chasing hogs as a kid that got out, the cows get out. Like,
Yeah,
we know what happens with fences. But but the technology is solid. It's going to become more convenient over time.
definitely.
And you talked about you have to be able to identify where you want them to be.
Mhm.
Whoever is it sounds intuitive, but I'm guessing there's some learning curve. So
Yes.
that sounds great. What's the cost right now?
Yeah, so each of the companies has a different cost. So it's basically cost of collars and then cost of towers to receive and send signals. So each of the companies does it differently. They're set up differently, and this information is all online, so you can see it and evaluate for yourself in your operation what would work best. But some companies do like you pay X amount for a collar for a year, and some do you pay X amount for a collar and then you just have it. You don't have to pay per year. They're all different.
Lifetime?
Yeah,
How long do
exactly.
they last?
So that depends. That's a great question. There are different considerations there. So if you're thinking about battery life, some of them are solar powered and some of them are battery powered where you have to change the batteries. Some are the solar powered ones, you don't have to change the batteries. So if you're talking about individual collars, how long they last, obviously it depends, the answer to everything. And then as far as the collars themselves, how long they will last, from what I understand, they last until they break or until the technology advances and the company needs to update the collars. And I don't have details on how often that is. That would be a question for one of the different company representatives.
Yeah. I don't even know if you talked about the individual costs, if it mean anything to me, but is there sticker shock if a producer is looking to buy it on their own right now?
So, like I said earlier, it depends is the answer to everything. But
Well, I'm an
it depends
economist. I know that.
yeah. It depends on how many animals the
Yeah.
producer wants to collar. It also depends on how big of an area they're hoping to use it on. It depends on like the topography of the area. So
Yep.
if there are a lot of canyons or if there's a steep area or if there are a lot of mountainous areas that'll block signals and you might have to get more towers and so there are different considerations for each one of those things.
So is it hooked up to a satellite? If there's no cell phone coverage, it doesn't work. How is that? How can
So
we think
each one
about
of the
that?
great question. Yeah, these are very good questions. So each one of the companies sets it up differently. Currently, I'm trying to think. I think one of the companies, gosh, I don't want to say the wrong thing. It depends. Some of
Okay.
the companies operate based on if you have cell service, it'll work here. Some of the companies operate based on where the towers are. Yeah, gosh, I really don't want to give you wrong information, so I'm going to have to say you'll have to do your own research.
Have you done any sort of feasibility studies? Say, hey, here's what the collars cost, but here's what you're spending on fencing. Here's all the time you spend on fencing. Have you done some comparisons like that?
That's a great question. I'm sorry, we haven't published a feasibility study
Okay.
on that.
Yep.
I'm sure somebody has
Yep.
because it's an
Okay.
important topic and a hot topic right now, so I do
Yeah.
believe that there's something out there that says that.
Okay. Okay. So I'm pretty sure with rotational grazing being what it is, that the some of the conservation programs like EQIP, environmental quality incentives programs, they'll pay for fencing to set up
Mm-hmm.
rotational grazing.
Mm-hmm.
Have they started paying for collars yet, or is this
There is
do
cost
you know
share
about that?
available within the Farm Bill. That happened,
Okay.
I believe, last year, is when that was initially put into the programming. I don't know if they're still developing that or if they set a plan and they're going with it, but I do know that it does exist.
I think that, a lot of times it's the cost, but it's also something new, and
Yeah,
those programs play a role in
definitely.
that. So,
Definitely,
okay.
yes.
So that makes sense. All right. What excites me about it, well, I mean, we have a lot of cattle. And you're a Texan,
Yes.
is that if you can, we graze residues here, where there's a lot of farmers that are experimenting with cover crops, having a living root year round, regenerative agriculture, and livestock integration. They tell me it's good for the soil. Yeah, but I think as an economist, if you have livestock integration, that can make cover crops much more economically viable.
Mm-hmm.
And that this, virtual fencing would have to make that so much easier than it is right now.
Yeah, I can't speak to that specifically. It's just something that I haven't learned about yet. But I do know that the virtual fencing technology is making a lot of things easier for producers, and the feedback
Yeah.
that we've heard has been generally very good.
That's a very exciting technology. I think it could be a real game changer in a
Definitely.
lot of places. Anything else about it that we haven't discussed yet?
Man, I'm sure there's a lot about it that we haven't discussed yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just went to a meeting where virtual fencing was one of the biggest topics that we discussed. And one of the things that I thought was the most interesting is there was a panel of producers that went up and talked about their experiences, and then there was time for questions. So the producer to producer questions, that was really valuable. And then they did the same thing with state agency people and federal agency representatives. They had a panel and people were able to ask questions about that, such as how
Yeah.
would this work on my federal lease? Things like that. So specific
Okay.
questions that, aren't the first top 5 questions in your head, but that
Right.
you still do want to know. And then there was another panel with a representative from each of the 4 virtual fencing companies that got up and spoke. And so I think things like that at this stage of virtual fencing, when people still have questions and people are still trying new things, it's extremely valuable just to have an opportunity to talk to the people who have done it before and see
Yeah.
what they have to say.
Right. So you said it came from New Zealand. If somebody wanted to learn about it, I mean, you could go to New Zealand for a lot of reasons. Are there places in New Zealand or elsewhere where it's widespread and widely adopted?
Yes. So that's a great question. I know that in New Zealand, at least one of the companies has been operating for, gosh, I think somebody told me around 15 years. So I think by now they've got their system down. And I remember when I was starting to learn about it, I would look up peer-reviewed research about virtual fencing, and a lot of the studies came from New Zealand or
Okay.
Australia. So I would say it's a good
Okay.
place to start, for sure.
Okay. And where in the U.S. do you think it's being used or piloted most widely now?
Man, most widely, obviously, my expertise is more in the West, so
Yeah.
Colorado, Montana, Wyoming. So that's
Mm-hmm.
obviously where my mind goes. I'm not as
Yeah.
familiar with work on it in the Eastern United States, but I know that
Yeah.
it's not a stranger to them there. They've definitely
Yeah.
implemented it there as well.
Heck, if I've heard about it. Uh, But and what are good resources if somebody wants to learn more?
Great question. So one that I have used quite a bit and I found very helpful is comes from the University of Arizona, has put out quite a bit of research on virtual fencing, and they do have a place on their website where you can go, and they do have a breakdown of like the different companies and the different sorts of collars, and
Okay.
if your operation looks like this, you might want to look into this company, and just
Right.
a really one-stop shop place to find
Okay.
information.
Are there any groups that were early adopters of this that you've identified, say for predators or something like that? Does it work with wolves? It's
From what
Montana. You got to ask about wolves, right?
Yeah, great question. From what I've heard from the one producer who's doing work specifically related to wolf and livestock conflict management, it is helping a lot.
Okay.
And so I'm optimistic about it working more and in different ways in the future. So yes, short answer to that one. And then early adopters, man, I came in a couple years after it came to the US and started taking. So I wish I could speak more to early adopters, but I wish I had that information on hand. I just don't.
So let's switch gears a little bit here. There's a couple questions I always ask people. The first is if you think about conservation policy, you think about it broadly or specifically related to your work. Could you talk about something that you're pessimistic about right now, but also something that you're optimistic about?
Absolutely. Yes. It's a great question. Something that I am not going to say I'm pessimistic about. I am positive about it and I hope to see it improve in upcoming years is just that conservation and agriculture are often treated as separate things when they are so deeply related and intertwined. And so that leads to things like policy forgetting the producer and policy conversations happening just so far away from producers on the ground, which eventually will lead to the solution being something that's hard to implement, or it takes so much time to apply to a program or apply for funding or something. And so it kind of turns people away from using that thing. And so it's something that I've heard people here at PERC talk about. And we have, like I said, people in law and policy departments and research departments, and then us on the ground. And so I know it's something that people are aware of. And so I'm excited to see it improve in upcoming years. And then something optimistic about is that the producers that we work with and that I have worked with personally just throughout my career are extremely knowledgeable about conservation. They care about conservation and they're interested in how they can implement it on their properties. And so when we're thinking about conservation work in the future, it's exciting to have those partners who are enthusiastic about it and looking for ways to get involved.
People say farmers are the original conservationists. A little bit too much for my taste, but you know, it's true. There's always been, you know, your livelihood depends on resources, depends on the soil, it depends on water.
Absolutely,
It's a
yes.
part of farming, ranching.
Exactly. And landowners and managers are the people that are out there every single day working alongside natural resources. And so what better resource do we have than those people that are out there every single day?
Okay, next question. Is there anything about your work that you feel like is misunderstood? This is optional. I'm an academic, so I feel misunderstood sometimes.
Yeah, I think that similar to what I was just talking about, you know, I think something that's misunderstood oftentimes is just the value of intact private lands. And that is something that I see day to day, but not everybody gets to see that. And so it's so important as development and subdivision of properties continues and expands. It's so important to find ways to maintain things like migration corridors for wildlife or ecologically sensitive areas like riparian areas and different things. And a lot of those resources are found on private lands. And so the more that we can involve landowners and managers in our stewardship of that land and in hand with how they're already doing it, the better. And something that we pay attention to a lot at PERC, we try to, one, highlight the stories of the people that are doing this work. And two, we try to share the burden with them and let them know that, you know, we see what you're doing. What you're doing is important. And we're here to help you and figure out solutions together to figure out what we can do going forward.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. All right. Now, you're in charge for a day and you get to change one policy.
Gosh, wow, that would be...
What would you do? It's not a test. You don't have to pick the best one, but if there's like one thing you could do, for sure.
That's a great question. I think, man, and like I said before, people in our law and policy department could probably speak to specific policies better than I could. It's just a little outside my wheelhouse. But I think that I would, you know, work with different Farm Bill programs and people who create and implement Farm Bill programs just to make it a little bit more accessible to anyone who's applying. I did a small amount of time with Pheasants Forever in Wyoming, where I was housed in an NRCS office. And we get people coming in every single day to ask questions and, you know, how do I fill out this part of the form and where do I need to go to find this information? And so I just want to make it more user-friendly.
Right. Yeah, I've heard about that. And also that having knowledgeable staff in those counties, those county offices, I have heard over and over that is invaluable.
Absolutely.
Navigating the systems.
And those programs are created with great intentions. It's just the next step of just putting them on the ground is where I think we need a little push, a little like oomph.
Yep, absolutely. Well, the funding is there. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, I forget the numbers that it's called, but the legislation in July did really lock in a lot of that conservation funding. So
that's great.
Usually not enough to go around. I think that'll always be the case.
All right.
There's a lot of farmers that want to do this, but I think the funding will be there.
And that's so great. We're there. We're there. We just need to put it on the ground.
Yep. Absolutely. All right. Well, those are all my questions. Anything else that you wanted to discuss or that you thought I was going to ask that I didn't?
Well, what would you do if you were in charge for a day?
I've thought about that because I've asked it so many times now. So there's two things. Would be our labor policy. I would let the agricultural sector sort all the interests, sort out their own compromises and do it separate from the national dialogue. Because they've done that like 15 times.
Huh.
and really like hard fought compromises between different interest groups. So let them do it. And it's sort of the national, it's not a hot button. It's hot button, but it's a dividing line. It's one of our political dividing lines right now. And so I get it, but like, let's ag take care of it and
Sure,
pretend
yeah.
everything else doesn't exist. So that's one thing. The other thing is a reset on the farm safety net. A lot of what we have today is based on history. And I think if you could just sort of reset it, I think you could build something that's more forward looking.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. I'm glad that you have a good answer to that. You clearly had lots of time to think about it. So
So I thought about, like, I better have an answer for this.
yeah.
You're the
Yeah.
first person to ask me this. So
Oh,
thank
no
you.
way. That's a fun
Yeah.
one. I like that question.
Yep. No, it's been really neat hearing what people have to say.
Yeah, I bet. That's awesome.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me, and I hope you have a great one.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Smoke and Mirrors. If today made you think or see things a little differently, share it with someone who appreciates cutting through the noise. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for spending part of the day with us. Until next time, keep asking what matters.